The less you know, the less you will value, and the less you will feel. Conversely, to be is to be something. However, you are cheating your character with intellectual shrinkage. As a result, your capacity for happiness is reduced, yet to recognize everything that is good in this world entails awareness. You are building your character. With that, your capacity for happiness will be optimized. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Moneyball Method Podcast. My name is Mark Shupe, the author of the Moneyball Method, a Middle-Class Manifesto for objective investing. And what I'd like to talk about today is a couple of subjects that are related. One I call intellectual shrinkage, and the other one has to do with economic shrinkage. In particular, these subjects were presented to me by a speaker at a conference I attended a couple of weeks ago that was organized and hosted by the Ayn Rand Institute. The speaker, who I'm going to reference here a little bit, is Tara Smith. She is a philosophy professor at the University of Texas in Austin. And I'm going to begin with defining a couple of concepts. One is the term shrinkage itself. Now, I got my degree in accounting, and to me, shrinkage is an accounting term that means theft of inventory. However, intellectual shrinkage is something a little bit different. It is the decline in your ability to think in abstract concepts. And this is critically important. Conceptual thinking is what separates human life from sentient animals. And the title of her talk was Intellectual Shrinkage and its Costs. So what are the costs of intellectual shrinkage? According to Dr. Smith, the less you know, the less you will value, and the less you will feel. Conversely, to be is to be something. However, you are cheating your character with intellectual shrinkage. As a result, your capacity for happiness is reduced, yet to recognize everything that is good in this world entails awareness. Regarding progressive government-mandated education, who teaches slogans and ready-made answers, these memorized responses will blunt your judgment. In fact, this cognitive erosion in our culture is evidence of a shift from deep active reasoning that caused America's prosperity in the first place, and from independent thinking, our inability to understand cause and effect. However, these costs are not easily measured. Dr. Smith referred to them as invisibles. They are the invisible costs of government monopoly education. However, there are measurable costs to college administration budgets, humanity department salaries and benefits, and diversity officers and their staff and the research grants that support them. In fact, according to a report published in 2024, only a couple of years ago, by Bowdoin College in Ohio, a $172,000 per year associate vice president had been hired to oversee the work of committees charged with considering a change in the academic calendar. This was a university position. It was a provost. And as told to a Bloomberg reporter, it was explained, my job is to make sure these 7 or 8 committees are aware of what's going on in other committees. A $172,000 a year provost overseeing a committee that oversees 7 committees. That is what we call the extraction economy. It does not create value. It does not create any form of worthwhile activity other than activity for the sake of activity. In fact, regarding college education, the percent of total university spending for instruction has decreased from 41% of budgets to 29% since 1980. In other words, over the last 46 years, the money dedicated to teaching students has been cut in half as a percentage of total university expenditures. And according to the Department of Education, administrative positions at colleges and universities grew by 60% between 1993 and 2009. Again, the extraction economy at work. in the university system, doubling the size of the administrative staff that does not teach children or students anything. So not only is education a low priority in America's university systems, the education standards have devolved into a mechanism for producing sheep who would rather change the world with activism or government jobs. As a result, administration and compliance with hundreds of regulatory bureaucracies have created the invisible economy for extracting wealth from the private sector that produces everything. Two examples of this are the lawyers who work for state government and the economic development agencies of city and county governments. And in that environment, there is no value creation, wealth is consumed, productivity is impaired, capital is stagnant, and the self-esteem of the people who doing what they know to be bullshit jobs is limited to slogans and what they can borrow from their tribe. But I'd like to switch gears from higher education and the education bureaucracy to medical services, to healthcare. Regarding the extraction economy, and in a report published last month by Becker's Hospital Review, administrative and technology consume 25% to 35% of all healthcare spending in the United States. 1/3 of healthcare is not dedicated to healthcare. In fact, they trace the cost burden, and I quote, to 20 to 30 years of extensive compliance, reporting, and documentation requirements, which were compounded by the revenue cycle infrastructure hospitals need to manage the growing complexity around coverage, authorization processes, along with advanced analytics and reporting integration. That is a mouthful. That takes money, people, salaries, benefits, and that is only 1/3 of the 5.3 trillion with a T dollars that was spent in 2024 on healthcare in the United States. The remaining 3.5 trillion is not subject to competitive pricing. First, doctors have little control over the price of their services, hospitals have little control over the services they are allowed to provide, and patients don't care about costs so long as they pay little or nothing for their world-class care. And then there are the certificates of need requirements for government approval of hospital facilities. This was proven during the Wuhan pandemic of 2020 to 22. It is impossible for medical care industry to be nimble and efficient if everything they want to do to respond to changing circumstance requires a certificate of need authorization. On top of that, there are diagnostic and lab tests, plus hospitalization and prescriptions that may not be necessary, except for compliance and avoiding malpractice suits. However, these costs are impossible to quantify because all of them have a combination of causes. Not only are they used as defenses against malpractice suits, but there are incentive structures within government reimbursement schemes. And there is a high patient demand for tests because Medicare and Medicaid patients do not have to pay. This is what happens when healthcare is treated as a right. Doctors, technicians, and taxpayers become the slaves of healthcare. But there's more to the extraction economy than just the highly regulated education and medical services industries. And I'm going to switch gears to what I call money laundering. Generally speaking, the extraction economy is led by the regulatory state that requires corporate compliance officers who need process reports from analysts who identify problems that demand greater compliance costs. That's the generalization. More specifically, one of those is anti-money laundering regulations that are intended for criminal activities such as illegal drug smuggling, terrorist organizations, and other black market activity. But as quoted in my July 11th Substack article, beneath the surface lie hidden costs of anti-money laundering compliance that often go overlooked, but significantly drag down efficiency and growth. First, there are the false positives and redundant alerts that bog down teams within banks. There are siloed tools and manual processes that sap productivity. And then there is excessive caution and fragmented technology that can slow customer onboarding and drive good customers away. Say none of the anti-money laundering is reliable for stopping Medicare fraud, child care fraud, paycheck protection program fraud, unemployment claim fraud, SBA loan fraud, all of which amount to countless billions of dollars. And none of it is reliable for stopping the non-governmental organization fraud of federal agencies paying off political donors. Thousands of NGOs have received countless billions of private wealth redistribution for green energy scams, homelessness scams, and high-speed rail scams. For example, in one report from 2024 and released by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, $3.5 billion was announced for 7,000 homeless service projects, meaning NGOs, in their continuum of care program. That is true money laundering. Next, I'd like to move into my specialty, the investment management industry. In the world of private investing in secondary market securities like stocks, bonds, and mutual funds, there is a cottage industry of reports from economists and strategists who identify problems with the flow of capital to different sectors of the market. They believe that markets are not efficient. One value proposition for this economic and financial research is to predict the future and beat the market for a fee. Another value proposition for this research is to create packaged products that give investors stock market participation with zero or limited market risk for an even larger fee. On the plus side, much of the fundamental research is valuable and it adds significantly to the efficiency of markets. But that means nearly all of it is priced into the securities that are listed on the exchanges. Markets are efficient. Even better, using the Moneyball method, you can extricate yourself from all of this extraction market activity. 1, by ignoring the government central planners, such as the Fed. 2, by ignoring the strategists, particularly those who support the Fed. 3, by ignoring money supply policy, trade deficits, and consumer sentiment, whatever that is. 4, by ignoring stock recommendations and price targets. 5, by ignoring mutual fund ratings and track records for outperformance. And 6, by ignoring fixed index annuities and registered index-linked annuities. To conclude, I'd like to help you learn how to live the one life you have with confidence. Instead of bearing those costs, wealth-oriented investors use the most reliable historical data and measure for performance with the only benchmark that matters, their statistically high confidence for living with purpose and pride. That is the entrepreneurial mindset. Create the vision, take calculated risks, learn from experience, and measure success as dollars of future wealth. And getting back to where I began with the intellectual shrinkage and its costs as introduced by Dr. Smith, I would like to recommend the more you know, the more you will value, and the more you will feel. To be is to be something. You are building your character. And with that, your capacity for happiness will be optimized. I would like to thank you for joining me today, talking about intellectual shrinkage and the shrinkage that occurs from the extraction economy, and I hope to see you next week. Have a great week.